Alright, hello, my name is AJ Jaramillo, and today I will be refuting the claim that the death penalty has a significant negative impact on society. I will do so by refuting the advocate's main claims or secondary claims that it negatively affects the court system, that it negatively affects society, that there is a racial bias involved with the death penalty, and that the death penalty doesn't deter crime. First, I will address the claim that the death penalty negatively affects the court system. Simply put, the evidence that the advocate had presented wasn't very sound. A study was conducted that supposedly found that 4.1% of people who were executed under the death penalty were found to be innocent. However, the study did not prove any means of innocence, but rather just said, under certain situations, it is a likely hypothetical that this person was innocent. When you take this study as a fact, you're simply going to assume that this man who's looking at cases after the fact knows more about the case than a jury did when they were making the decision of guilt in the first place. Moving on to the second claim, that the death penalty negatively affects society. The advocate spent a large amount of time on this claim focusing on the aspect that the death penalty diverts attention from more important issues, such as diverting lawyers' attention from focusing on things such as misdemeanor crimes in court. However, no evidence was supported to back this up, and there's really not even a logical connection between that. The people who are assigned a certain case are going to see this case through to the end. And so, yeah. Also, in the previous claim, the advocate had went on and on about how it was a horrible fact that 4.1% of executed inmates were innocent. However, within the second claim, the advocate also goes on to talk at great length about how much time and money is spent on the whole system that eventually leads up to the final execution. By the way that the advocate had presented the information, they made it sound like it was excessive at that point, that they were spending so much time to ensure that the person they were executing was guilty, which really diminishes both the arguments, because on one claim, they're saying that the person, they are executing innocent people and this needs to stop. And then their second claim, they're saying we're spending too much time to make sure this is done properly in the first place. And so both claims just feel weak when presented right next to each other. Moving on to the third claim, that there is a racial bias within the death penalty. There is no specific or excessive amount of racial bias when studies are conducted on the subject. The advocate presented a report from 1990 that found that 82% of studies found race as an influence on deciding whether or not the defendant deserved to get the death penalty. However, when you just consider that this report was from 1990, reporting what they had found on studies conducted earlier than that, that is not a modern or very reflective of the situation today as to what these real statistics would look like. A new study conducted by Mona Lynch, an author of the critically acclaimed book Law and Human Behavior, found the amount of bias was consistent among all cases involving a jury and was not specific to any one particular death penalty case. And while it was found that there was a certain amount of bias found between white jurors and black defendants, the amount was still minimal because the whole selection of the jury is to try to prevent this amount of racial bias in the first place. Also within this third claim, the advocate also made the point that there has not been a single white killer of a black person that has ever been executed in Florida. However, this is just a sweeping generalization, and it doesn't really reflect the entire country as a whole as to whether or not there's a racial bias issue. It just shows that there might be an issue in Florida alone. Moving on to the fourth and final claim, that the death penalty is not a proper crime deterrent, the advocate made a special point of pointing out that the death penalty does not deter murder. And the fact of the matter is that that is relatively true, but it's because murder is not something that's usually committed with the idea that it is a crime in mind. Most murders are committed when the murderer or the killer is not within a stable state of mind, be it in self-defense, extreme anger, a mental instability, These murderers are not thinking, weighing out the pros and cons like a petty theft or something. What would happen if I get caught? What happens if I go to jail? They're doing something, they're doing this crime in the heat of the moment, and no amount of repercussions is really going to deter them from it. A study conducted by Professor Des Boksch of the Emory University found substantial evidence supporting that there is a substantial deterrence of crime overall, ignoring simply murders, when the death penalty was instated within these states. This study was conducted over a span of 30 years and found that 96% found that a significant amount of crimes among 96 different regression models showed a significant relation between the institution of the death penalty and overall crime rates dropping. So hopefully you can see that by addressing the idea that the death penalty negatively affects the court system, society, that the death penalty has a racial bias to it, and that it doesn't deter crime, you can see that these claims are either not well-founded or simply wrong under a modern context. And you can see that the death penalty does not have a significant negative impact on society.
All right, the main and secondary claims are labeled, and there were a lot of those secondary claims, which made it a little bit more complex. The idea about the court system argument, I think you dealing with the issue of people being innocent or not innocent, you have a challenge to the evidence that the advocate presented. It's a very generic challenge. That is a reasonable press on this situation. I think you could probably use a little bit of research on your own, but the idea that some researcher who after the fact is making a judgment that somebody had to be innocent is more reliable than a judge, a jury, and the entire court system in evaluating that kind of process, I think that's a reason, like I said, that's a reasonable press to make on that particular point. And I think there's probably more arguments to make on that issue, and that's a big issue that comes up in a couple of spots, so maybe a little bit more work on that would be helpful. On the issue of the impact on society, the diversion of resources, that sort of thing, you challenge the lack of evidence that the advocate presents. I thought that that's reasonable. The conundrum that it presents, wow, we're spending an excessive amount of time and money to ensure that somebody who might be innocent isn't executed, and to make sure that guilty people go to jail. Why is that a bad thing? And is there any? I think there's some other presses that you need to make. Do we have limited resources? Has anybody not gotten prosecuted? Has there been any harm that's occurred because we've devoted our resources to that? I think there's some good questions to ask there. If you at least ask those questions, that would put on some press. I think there's probably some good evidence too to suggest that there's not a huge backlog, especially of significant crimes. And most of the backlogs that exist in the criminal justice system have nothing to do with the trial process, and they have everything to do with the punishment process. We don't have enough prison space, or it's taken too long to execute people, or something like that, as opposed to people never get to trial. Maybe there's an argument there, but I don't remember if the advocate presented any evidence on that point, and I think that that's a good press to be making. I thought that, again, another good challenge to the evidence that the advocate presented on racial discrimination. Their research is based, it's reported in 1990, and all of those 82 studies that get cited had to have occurred before then. There might be, you might want to give us a little bit context. Why is that time difference important? For example, the courts in the 1970s got rid of the death penalty, and then they allowed it to be reinstated after they changed a lot of the ways the laws work, and people who were subsequently convicted, they might have been convicted under different rules that would have prevented this. But we don't know what all of those studies are that talked about racial bias and whether or not they occurred after those changes in the policy. So I think there's a little bit more information that you've got there. You've got the right argument to make there. I think you could make it a little bit stronger if there was a little bit more context there. argument on deterrence, I don't know that you want to go ahead and concede that there isn't any deterrence on murder. I think you're letting them have something there that they don't necessarily deserve, and there's research that you could use on that particular point. If you don't want to, that's okay. I like the argument that you have that says, well, regardless of whether or not you think it deters murder, we do know that it has an effect on general crime, which means that there is a value to the death penalty that the advocate has ignored, and then you can present that last piece of evidence. I thought that was pretty effective. All right, sorry, we've got to cut off here because we